Hi, everybody. We're going to go over some terms and artwork to know for the Unit 1 test. So this is basically in the order that we learned these terms and objects. So we're starting off with prehistoric. A couple important things to know here are the two different main types of tools that the prehistoric stone carvers would have used. The stone blades or stone chisels would have been used for taking out really large sections of stone. And the smaller tool for the more fine detailed incising or scratching into of lines and details would be our stone burin. So blades and chisels for carving, the burin for incising. We also want to remember a couple other terms here: Paleolithic and Neolithic. Litho means stone. Paleo is old, Neo is new. So Paleolithic is the old Stone Age. That's our oldest examples going back at least 30,000 years ago, looking at things like the cave paintings and the smallest sculptures like the Venus statuettes. The Neolithic, or the New Stone Age, would have been the time period during which we start seeing settled communities and things like the megaliths, the structures like Stonehenge. Here's your example of your stone burins on this slide compared to the stone blades on this slide. Definitely want to remember the difference between sculpture in the round and relief. So the main thing to be aware of here is that technically both of these are three-dimensional sculptures. It's just that one type is fully free from the block, and you can see that type of image all the way around. If you can go all the way around it, 360-degree view, then you have a sculpture in the round. Now, it may or may not be attached to a base to support it, but you can see that we can see different points of view there on the Venus of Willendorf. On our Lasalle Venus, though, you see that she can only be seen from one point of view, and the image projects somewhat from that more or less flat background. So relief sculpture sometimes can be incised in or project outward from, and we'll see different reliefs that extend even further than she does. But actually think of relief as a sculpture that the image projects from a flattish background. Artworks to know, of course, include the Paleolithic Venus of Willendorf, and you see here that you can clearly see her from different points of view. You want to remember that she is a small object. Figures like this exist throughout finds throughout Europe. They are small handheld things that could be carried. Most of the time, the reproductive or the child-carrying aspects of the body are really exaggerated. The breasts, hips are very much larger, out of proportion even to the arms and legs. Most of them don't have faces, as in this case, the Venus of Willendorf, we definitely see evidence of some types of woven or knitted garment here, at least in terms of her hat. So think of them as being made for and by nomadic people, people who are not settled into specific communities, living in one location their whole lives, and probably serving some kind of purpose of bringing good fortune or protection to pregnant women. Certainly the woman holding bison horn is a similar example. She's equally as exaggerated in terms of the hip area and the chest, but very different from the figures that are fully in the round that could be carried. This gives you an opportunity, or gives the artist an opportunity, to put the legs and arms in slightly different positions. You run the risk of arms and legs being easily broken off if they extend from the core of the body in a fully three-dimensional work, and we don't have that in this case. Remember that most of these prehistoric and ancient sculptures would also have been painted or pigmented. You can sometimes see traces, particularly of red, with the female figures. Speaking of those pigments, we definitely saw a lot of use of red and yellow ochre, ochre being essentially an earth mineral found throughout Europe and, in fact, throughout the world. The black that we most often see in those ancient cave paintings is carbon, burned wood, essentially, charcoal. We definitely saw the use of the human hand almost as a stencil or a reverse stencil, allowing the use of the blowpipe to blow the pigment around the fingers to create a negative impression in cave art. And you see that happening right here. There's the blowpipe, which could have been a reed or a hollow bone, but you can see here kind of a contemporary person using their own hand to make handprints in the style of our prehistoric cave ancestors. We definitely use the term mural for paintings on walls, and we can apply that all the way back to the prehistoric times. The reason I wanted you to see this slide, though, was just to remember how difficult these areas are to access. The caves are, in some cases, would require you to belly crawl through really small openings, and the paintings themselves are usually quite large and oftentimes overhead. So this is something that would have required an enormous amount of effort to create and an enormous amount of planning. We definitely see the composite view. I want to stress this. The composite view means seeing different points of view of the same object or figure within a depiction of that object or figure. So you see the horns on our bull as if you're looking at the bull head on, but you see the head and legs as if you're seeing it in profile. So we have the composite view going as far back as the prehistoric cave art. We certainly associate it probably more than any other culture. We associate it with Egypt, but you saw it all the way through ancient Mesopotamia, and you'll see it again into ancient Greece as well. One of the cave paintings to know for the test, pretty easy to recognize because of the handprints, is the spotted horse's negative handprints from the Peshmeral cave in France. We also want to be able to recognize, of course, the Paleolithic Lascaux cave painting, the Hall of the Bulls. We want to be able to tell the difference between those two, of course, and this one. This is coming closer to us in time. This is a Neolithic era from Catalhuyuk in Turkey. This is detail from a mural painting in a home. This depicts a deer hunt. So remember that you could see the composite view here, both in the animals and in the human figures. See, the torso is turned towards you, but the legs and head are in profile here. And a lot of the decoration and artwork, two-dimensional and three-dimensional from Catalhuyuk, focuses very much on horned animals. So some vocab terms for us. Megalith, literally giant stone or great stone. Mega, great, litho, stone. So megalith, big stone. These are constructions that the best example I can give you, of course, would be Stonehenge. But think of the megaliths not as being permanent dwellings for the most part, but to mark sacred spaces, also to construct things like open-air temples. The construction is most often post and lintel. That is a pretty easy term to understand. Post is the vertical part. The lintel is the horizontal that spans that space between the two vertical posts. The henge essentially is a circular area of construction, usually stone or wood, but most often has also a ditch and a bank, and digging the ditch and repurposing the earth removed to make the ditch creates that embankment space. The trilithon you see most prominently within the structure of Stonehenge. That's your two posts, and the lintel above it are three-stoned structure. We definitely took a look at the orientation of the Temple of Stonehenge. We looked at it being built in different phases, so you can see the initial phase versus the final phase in this diagram. The chart that you see there as well also shows some alignment with different astral events, the most important of which being winter solstice sunset and summer solstice sunrise. So really that combines to create an axis through the center of the structure. So the Neolithic henge, Stonehenge, is the one to know for the test, and that's what it looks like currently. Moving our attention then to Mesopotamia. Remember, between the rivers essentially is what Mesopotamia means, between the Tigris and Euphrates in what is now modern-day Iran, Iraq. One of the earliest settled civilizations in human history. The area itself, the region, is controlled by different city-states. So different tribes or peoples gain control over essentially the same territory, and some of those empires are much, much larger than others. Certainly, when we looked at the Persians, that was the largest of the empires in this general region. But the Sumerian culture is really the first one to rise. This is all that we have left of a female statue. She is flat on the back and is obviously missing her body, so we imagine she would have had a formal wig / headdress. The eyes and eyebrows would have been inlaid, and she would have had a full body as well. This is the female head from the city of Uruk. The Warka vase is a Sumerian object that is very essential for us to understand some of the conventions of Sumerian representation. You see they use the composite view, the head in profile, the legs in profile as well. When you see the torsos on a lot of the figures, the torsos are turned. As you can see here, the torso is turned toward us in this case. We also know that the Sumerians were fond of using registers or bands to depict different events within the same artwork. The bottom of the bands in this case also equates to the ground line, literally meaning the ground that the figures are standing on. So they're not meant to be seen as if they're in different stories of a same building. These are meant to almost read as the same ground in each one of the registers, but we read it from top to bottom, rather from bottom to top. We see the vegetation, then animals, then the lower class people, and then we get to the upper class, including the priest king and the figure of the goddess Inanna. We see here that the procession alternates the direction. You can see the animals moving in an opposite direction, the men above them, to the figures bringing the votive to the goddess. So remember, registering ground line we've covered. We also want to think about the votive offering, what they're bringing to the goddess. The votive would be something that you would bring and leave in a temple, so it would stand there for you. It could be a container that held a liquid or food for the god or goddess. It could even be a statue that represents you that would stand there and do the act of praying for you while you were off doing other things. The hierarchy of scale is also an important thing for us to notice. Often it does equate also to location in the image, that sometimes the most important people are at the top. That's not always the case, though. With hierarchy of scale, hierarchy obviously is about who has power and who doesn't have power, but the term to really focus on there is scale. Hierarchy of scale. Scale implies a change in size. So even though these are meant to be human beings, you see this figure is much shorter than this figure. That doesn't mean that they are a younger person like a child and an adult. What we're seeing here instead is someone of higher status and someone of lower rank. So they still have the same proportions. Relative size of the head to the size of the torso, the size of the head to the length of the limbs, that stays standard from figure to figure. But when you see one at a much larger scale, a larger size, that indicates a higher rank or a greater importance in the culture. So hierarchy of scale. Think of scale as a change in size. The Talismar figures were found buried beneath the floor of the temple, so they would likely have been placed there by a multitude of different people, meant to represent them standing in constant reverence to the goddess. And you can see here that they all have their hands clasped together near their chest. Most of them would have held small cups. You can kind of see that here. for holding liquid or other offerings. You also can see that the eyes are really enlarged, the eyebrows are really exaggerated as well, kind of into a single eyebrow. This creates a lot of focus on the face and on the awakeness, the alertness of the figure, as if they are almost overdoing the eyes in order to emphasize that they would never blink, never close their eyes, never take their attention away from honoring the goddess. We saw the Sumerians utilize the cylinder seals, a really pretty inventive way of creating images and text in clay. And the cylinder seal is, you could almost think of it as like a cylindrical bead. They often are pierced all the way through so they can be strung on a thong, but they are carved so that on the cylinder seal, the image of the person, for instance, creates a depression or a carve into the surface. When it's rolled across the clay, the area that isn't carved presses down to the clay. The area that's carved away is a place the clay is kind of pushed into. So it creates a relief where the figures become raised up from the background. So that's our cylinder seal from Sumeria. Again, we have an example of use of registers, and the bottom of each register in this case is a ground line. That is the Sumerian standard of the city of Ur. This is a burial site. We don't know for sure what this object would have been used for. It could actually have been a sounding board for a stringed instrument. It has been called the standard because the initial belief was that this object would have been carried into battle at the front of an army. And so you can see here, this is the war side. You can see our victorious army literally rolling over the bodies of their vanquished foes, and you can see the prisoners of war enslaved being taken before the leader here at the top register. Another object from Ur, this is the Sumerian bull-headed lyre, which has a decoration on the front of the sounding box that probably depicts aspects of the story of Gilgamesh. You can see that Gilgamesh fought here the scorpion-bodied people. Moving from the Sumerian culture to the Akkadian culture, when the Akkadians gain control of Mesopotamia, they're a little more warlike than the Sumerians. Most of the artwork that we have, though, is pretty similar in terms of the details in the face, with the eyes being very much exaggerated and that almost single brow or really overemphasized eyebrow being pretty prominent. Even the hairstyling is pretty similar to what we saw. This is a hollow core cast metal sculpture, which is a remarkable accomplishment in terms of technological ability to be as old as it is. This is a really difficult technique to be able to pull off with this level of accuracy. He also would have had a full body. The diagram to the right there gives you some sense of a cross-section of what the molds would have to look like. Usually the original is made in wax. In this case, wax around probably a plaster or sand core. That wax face or head and body would have had metal pins poked through it, and then another mold made around the outside of that, and then the wax melted out, and the pins would then hold the core, the inside, to keep it from slipping, leaving an empty space, almost like a sin around the sculpture, and then a hot metal, molten metal, would be poured in. Once it's cooled, the outer mold is broken off, the inner mold could be taken out as well. What we call the investment, the core on the inside, could be removed. An Akkadian object that speaks to their prowess in battle is the victory stele of Naram Sin. We know that this stele was subsequently claimed by a later king, and so his name was inscribed onto it, but we know in fact that it was meant for Naram Sin's victory. So this is a really unusual case in which, yes, we see hierarchy of scale. The king is much, much larger than the other people, but we don't actually have true registers in this sense, because what you're looking at is meant to be an outdoor landscape. You're seeing characters climb up a mountain in conflict. The battle takes place on the mountain. Generally, it divides in half. We have Naram Sin and his Akkadian soldiers on the left, and we have their victims, their vanquished enemy on the side. This is a stele, and a stele is an important term for us as well. It generally is a relief sculpture. It may or may not have text, but generally they are much taller than they are wide, and they are usually relief carvings. More often than not, these are created to commemorate important events, whether that might be a political moment or a battle. Either or would be kind of typical types of subjects that you could use for making a stele. We also saw the rise of the Sumerian culture a second time, what we call the Neo-Sumerian culture, the second rise of the people of Ur. This is their ziggurat from the city of Ur, and it is, of course, unfinished in this state. The temple at the top has been destroyed, so that would actually have another there. You get a sense, though, of going up these long staircases along these ramps. There's three main ramps. The two that flank the side of the face and the one that comes out at a 90-degree from that face, the main entrance there. So you would have climbed up all of these steps and then up again to another level to the temple. And that gives you a sense of what the temple would have looked like at the top. So they do sort of prefigure what the Egyptian pyramid might eventually look like. They are somewhat similar in structure in terms of having sloped walls, but the pyramids were specifically burial objects. They were not in temples themselves. The Neo-Sumerian sculpture is somewhat similar to what we've seen in ancient Mesopotamia overall, in that the objects generally don't have arms and legs, limbs extending out from the core of the body. This is one of a rather large group of statues celebrating the leader Gudea, and Gudea in this case is actually holding on his lap, and you can sort of see the outer edges of the walls here along that outside. That is a plan for a temple that being built to Gudea's specifications. So you see him presenting himself as a very powerful, forward-thinking kind of leader, very much interested in civil engineering and in public works in terms of building buildings, but also very devout. He almost always appears with his hands clasped and a very calm expression on his face. As Babylon rises, we have perhaps the most important stele of all for this unit, the stele of Hammurabi. The Hammurabi stele includes not only an image that also gives us a glimpse of that composite view. You see the profile on the face, the full forward torso here, profile legs. But it also is an example of hierarchy of scale, in that if this figure stood up, he would be much taller than this figure. You would think, if this is about Hammurabi, he's the king, that would be the figure on the throne, but the only figure who would be of higher rank than a king would be the god. So this is the god Samash, and he is handing the symbols of office to Hammurabi. He's handing him a scepter and a ring, which are sort of symbols that the right to rule has been passed from the gods to the king. They've got the divine right of kings. And the interesting aspect, other image on this piece, is all the carving below. There are nearly 300 separate individual laws from the code of Hammurabi inscribed in cuneiform on this object. As we move into the next phase of Mesopotamian culture, we have the rise of the Assyrians. And the Assyrians, of all of the Mesopotamian cultures we looked at, could probably be described as the most warlike or most war-focused. The Assyrian imagery very often is more violent than what we see in the artwork of the other cultures of Mesopotamia. So this is part of an entrance gate to the citadel of King Sargon II. It is what we call a lamassu. The lamassu is a mythological creature that has a human head on a bull body that also has the aspect somewhat of a lion, but also wings somewhat like an eagle. So it's kind of a hybrid creature. You can even see the ears don't look human, they look kind of animal on this sculpture of the lamassu. They are enormous. When you would walk into the citadel, you would be only about yay high, so they're pretty tall compared to a human being. They're meant to be seen as standing as guards when you see them head on. When you see them from the side, you can see that the legs actually appear to be if the creature is walking. So from the front, you only see 2 legs. From the side, you would see 4. Weirdly, that means that in total, from this angle, you can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 legs, even though the creature's meant logically to have 4. My personal favorite of the Assyrian artworks are these low relief depictions of the king hunting lions, and this is part of an enormous amount of decoration from the palace of Ashurbanipal. Now, the king was the only one who was allowed to do this type of lion hunt. He does have some assistants with him, but you can see that the king is engaged in kind of ritualistically killing these wild animals, claiming their power or showing his superiority over this kind of powerful animal force is part of the ceremony. The image is not meant to be seen as if this is taking place out of doors in nature, as if he's gone out to hunt lions for food or for sport. In fact, all of this is taking place in an arena. So the lions have been caught, brought to this place, and then put into the arena so that the king can, in front of his court and in front of his people, can make this kind of ritual sacrifice. The interesting thing in a lot of ancient art that you'll see the figures of the people, especially if it's someone of nobility, if it's the king or someone close to him in the court, they tend to be very stiff in their pose and their expression, very formal. So you start to feel almost as the ancient artists maybe didn't have the ability to express anything other than making kind of the same face or body over and over and over again. So it's always fascinating to look at how much expression, how much freedom of movement, emotion can be seen in the bodies of people who are of lower stature, or in this case, animals. If you really look at the detail in the musculature of the lions, their different poses, the lioness seems almost a broken neck in this pose. You can see that they're also more dynamic in how much reality there is in the way that they're depicted in three-dimensional space. The human figures are much more formal in this kind of composite view that we sort of associate with the ancient world. As Babylon rises for the second time, the Neo-Babylonian culture, we have a portion of the Ishtar Gate. This is in fact the front of the gate, and a much larger piece would have actually been behind it. This is made in a really kind of remarkable way. You're not seeing carving here. These are all made from glazed earthen clay bricks, and those glazed bricks are treated with copper to give it that blue color. But the sculptural aspect of the gate depicts alternating animals. There's these bull creatures, but then there's also these odd hybrids of lions in the back, eagle talons toward the front, and this kind of serpent. It's a traditional Neo-Babylonian image of a dragon. So they're really fierce creatures. They are created not by carving, but by modeling the clay. And each separate brick then would have had to have been hand modeled so that when the bricks are put together, they would combine to create these relief effects of the animals themselves. Really rather remarkable accomplishment. You can see that pretty clearly there as well. One of the terms that we're looking at, in addition to the glazing, the coloring of the brick itself, is that the object we're looking at is arcuated, meaning that it is constructed from or having arches. When we turned our attention to the Persian culture, we actually looked at two different flowerings of Persian culture in ancient Mesopotamia, and arguably the Persian Empire became the largest empire the world had ever seen up to this point. The first flowering of ancient Persia was put down or suppressed by the invasion of Alexander the Great, who was Macedonian, conquered Greece, and then conquered most of the Persian Empire. And when he arrived at Persepolis, which is what you see here, this was the city/palace of the Persian kings, and that's all that's left of it because Alexander had it burned to the ground. The palace itself is sort of a series of levels or series of plateaus, mostly with stone columns holding up a timber roof. So at the time that the Persian kings were at their absolute height, this would have been the location that all of the people who were subject to the Persian Empire would come to present their tribute. One of the things that's really kind of fascinating about the Persians is that they ruled in such a way that as long as you paid your taxes, as long as you sent your tribute to the king, you would still be allowed to practice your own religion. You could have your own language and cultural beliefs. All of that was fine. It was a relatively tolerant empire. It's sort of a model for the ancient Roman Empire, trying to kind of rule a multitude of different people of different backgrounds. This is from the second phase of the really rising of the Persian Empire. This is what's left of the Palace of Shapur I, another arcuated structure, and clearly one that has a multitude of arches in the design, but only this one is actually functional. Here, these are blind, meaning that they are decorative openings that don't actually go anywhere. That is what we refer to as a blind arcade. There's your blind arcade term for you. Then we moved our attention to ancient Egypt, and we could arguably say that this piece kind of marks or separates the union of the two halves of the Egyptian culture into one and founding the beginning of the Egyptian Empire. Egypt was essentially divided into two kingdoms, Upper and Lower Egypt. And so when those two were combined under King Narmer, we have the really beginnings of the Egyptian Empire. And that's exactly what you see here, is King Narmer in the same proportion in terms of the height of his head to the size of the torso, size of the limbs, same proportions for him as for all the other figures. They all share the same proportion. Proportion is all about the measurement of one part of the body compared to the whole. So the size of his head compared to his overall height, for example, that's a proportional issue. But he is at a larger size or same proportion, but larger. That makes it obvious who the king is. You can very clearly see that here. More important, less, far less. So that's a change in scale. That's our hierarchy of scale. The palette is carved on front and back. This is likely where the kohl, K-O-H-L, for the marking around the eye would have been. That black makeup around the eye we most likely believe to be similar to the way that NFL players put black on their faces to help with glare and reflection from the sun when they're on the field. So you can see here that the king is returning in triumph after having defeated many foes. You can see them lying down on the ground here, decapitated. You can also see symbolically the king crushing through the walled embankment around enemy city. Mastaba is our next big vocab term to associate with ancient Egypt, and mastaba literally means bench, so you can kind of think of this as a relatively low, flat-topped object. The mastaba was built to mark a tomb, and that was very much part of the Egyptian culture, of course, was the belief that your soul essentially was eternal. It lived outside of you, technically, we call it the Ka, and the Ka would not be damaged by your death. The Ka would return to the world, and as such, it needed to have a place to be housed, hence the mummification process and the amount of sculpture that is found in Egyptian tombs. The first named artist I can give you is Imhotep. Imhotep is the architect who designed a series of mastaba, one on top of the other, creating the new architectural form, the stepped pyramid. And this was for the pharaoh Dozier. So you see our first stepped pyramid, thanks to Imhotep. That rather quickly gives way to a new type of funerary architectural style in the Old Kingdom that is known as the pyramid. And the pyramids are truly massive structures, but they are not temples. They are tombs. And the kings, the pharaohs, were interred within them. So the mastaba would have marked a space where the tomb is down a shaft below. In the case of the pyramids, the tomb is inside. There are smaller pyramids there as well for queens and for the lesser members of the royal family, but the three main pyramids that you see in the photograph there are the pyramids of Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaure, and in that order. Remember, of course, with the dates, it's kind of confusing, of course, because the dates before the common year 0, the further back in time we go, the higher the numbers are. So the oldest of the pyramids is Khufu, the middle pyramid is Khafra, the more recent one is Menkaure. The Great Sphinx, of course, is to be associated with the Great Pyramids as well. Remember, it's a combination of a pharaoh's head and a lion's body. We looked at Khafra, this particular sculpture of him from his temple outside of the pyramid. It's where this actually comes from, but it does give us a sense of connection to some of the artwork of ancient Mesopotamia. It looks a little bit like the Gudea statue in that he is seated and his arm legs are kind of tight into the body. The way that the pharaoh is presented is very standard, and it's really hard unless you understand how to read the hieroglyphs. A lot of the pharaohs look almost identical one to the other in terms of their face and body. They were presented in a very idealized way, and they all wear the exact same or very, very similar garments. The wooden false beard that they wore, ceremonial beard, is almost always there. The headdress, and often the headdress is adorned with a serpent on the front, and that kind of striped skirt as well are very typical of the way the pharaohs presented themselves. This is Khafra wearing the nemes and the uraeus. The nemes is the striped headcloth, the uraeus is the sacred serpent that adorns it. And we talked about the Ka being your kind of eternal soul. Now, doesn't he look almost identical to Khafra? If you look at his face and body and clothing style, you wouldn't know unless someone told you, right? So the ancient Egyptians definitely presented their royal family, especially, in a very systematic, almost symbolic kind of way. Now, when the figures are fully three-dimensional, as in the seated statue or this standing statue of Menkaure and his queen, those figures are presented with their features, bodies, and legs all facing one direction. So these would not be examples of composite view at all. With the Egyptian two-dimensional artworks, whether they're reliefs or paintings on scrolls, that's when we'll see the composite view. With these fully three-dimensional objects, we're going to see the figures presented kind of full face. But the most important thing to recognize here is that they are meant to seem lively or alive. They have a slight smile, and they seem to take one step forward. Most of the time, those sculptures, if you were to see them from the side, back leg and the spine are in a perfectly straight line, and that leg that comes forward is touching the ground. That's actually physically impossible. If you tried to stand with your back flat against a wall and take one leg and take a step forward, you wouldn't be able to touch the ground unless your back, your spine, and shoulders came off of the wall and centered your body over empty space. The reason that the Egyptians don't do that, of course, is because then the figure becomes more prone to break, it becomes more delicate. If the body is centered over empty space on those thin ankles, it would be very easy for the figure to break. So you notice that there is a ton of stone in between the pharaoh and his wife, between even his side and his arm. All of that is filled in. All of this is about making the figures more permanent, making the sculptures more likely to last. We also see that if you're slightly lower down the social scale, we can have more natural in the depictions. This is someone who would have been of great importance and in fact had a relatively grand tomb for himself, but this seated scribe has a much more natural looking body than the pharaoh or the queen. You can see he has a little bit of a belly and rolls happening here. He looks a little saggy in the chest. He's a older middle-aged man, and his body has had the effect of gravity on it. We can see that unless you're depicting the pharaoh or a god, there's a little more freedom for the Egyptian artist to present things the way that they really look in the real world. There's a sense of an individual face in that expression, in this portraiture, in this piece. You can see that the statue is painted, and that is typical of most prehistoric and ancient statuary. We want to make that point again and again. This brings us to then low relief carving. This is from the tomb to Tai, and Tai is obviously in composite view here. You see him facing in profile with his face, facing toward us in the torso, in profile again with the legs. That's true for everyone around him. But he is not a giant. He is socially more important than his servant, so he is presented at a larger height. We can also see here with the hierarchy of scale that not only is he at a larger scale, but he's a little in more of a stiff traditional pose, whereas his hunters working for him have a little more dynamism in the way that they're posed. And even more so the way that the animals, both the hippopotami here in the river and then going up the trees to the tree limbs, you can see all of these natural forms, birds, lemurs, and other things in the trees that are absolutely more dynamic and more natural looking. As we move from the Old Kingdom to the Middle Kingdom, the tendency for the tombs to be raided is very, very high. We know that grave robbers took a lot of the gold and the things that were left in the tombs. And so those big pyramids are just sort of like putting a spotlight out and saying, hey, there's treasure inside of these. So people began to honor the pharaohs, having them interred in tombs that were cut into cliffs. So bizarrely, what you're seeing here is not like a cave that has architecture added into it. Think of it as solid rock that is carved to create architectural rooms within. And so that becomes the new burial trend in the Middle Kingdom. The rock-cut tombs at Beni Hassan are a really good example of this kind of structure. We can also see that the columns are not just smooth around the outside, they are fluted, which means that they have been carved with these grooves to run in a vertical direction. The most impressive of these rock-cut tombs comes to us from the New Kingdom. This is the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut. So it's her funeral place, but it's also a temple to the gods. And that's kind of a fusion of funeral with religious temple structure. So this piece indicates for us her status and her power. One of the female pharaohs of ancient Egypt, Hatshepsut, was actually not necessarily meant to be the ruler. In fact, the ancient Egyptians don't have a term for female pharaoh. There isn't even a word for queen. Essentially, the word pharaoh means king, and then the king has a wife. So Hatshepsut, when she rises to power, she's meant to be regent, but she actually claims power as the pharaoh. And there are multiple carvings of her, statues of her, in which she wears the traditional male garb, including the false beard. It's very hard to tell that she's female at all from those depictions. So she fits herself into this iconographic visual system of representation. The images of the pharaoh all look identical. A colonnade is a term that comes up for us, especially looking at the architecture of the temple for Hatshepsut. The colonnade would be a long sequence of columns that are joined together. So they might be freestanding in a row. There's a colonnade, for instance, in front of the temple that we just looked at. You can see columns sometimes along the sides as actual parts of the architecture, or they could form kind of ritual walkways leading up toward a temple or toward another building. The columns themselves in these are often what we refer to as chamfered, meaning that instead of coming to a 90-degree angle, they have been beveled. You also see here the term facade, and that's going to come up more in the New Kingdom than any other area in ancient Egypt. The facade would be the front of the building. In this case, for our purposes, most of the facades we can look at are facades of temples. This is a New Kingdom temple of Ramses II. All of those massive statues are meant to represent Ramses himself. It was carved into the stone of the cliff face, and in fact, when the Aswan Dam was constructed, there was the possibility that the original site of Ramses' temple would have flooded, so the whole thing was taken apart and lovingly reassembled exactly as it was at a safe distance. The interior is remarkable, and when we look at the interior of Ramses' temple, there are these columns that are carved into statues of the pharaoh. And so when we have carved statuary that are functioning as columns, if they're male, they're called Atlantids. And when we turn to ancient Greece, we'll see examples of carved columns that are carved to look like female figures. Those are called caryatids. Atlantids are male, caryatids female. Here's a colonnade structure. This is the hypostyle hall of the Temple of Amun-Ra at Karnak. And so this is a temple to a god, not to the pharaoh. And you can see here, even though the roof is gone, that the columns rise to two different heights, and that allows us to create this difference in height here, right, from the shorter columns to the height raised by the taller ones, allows us to put in windows, and that is referred to as the clerestory. That's the level where the light comes in. You can kind of see it coming in through here and through here. Again, these would have been brightly painted, and what we see with these carvings is that the relief doesn't project forward from the background. In this case, the carving is recessed into the surface. We refer to that as a sunken relief, and that's pretty popular in the New Kingdom era. The pylon is the gateway, the entrance to the temple. So these pylons do sort of reference the pyramid shapes, although they are flat across the top. The pylon is your gate entrance. Often followed behind it would be a colonnaded hall, hypostyle hall, like we just saw, leading toward the temple itself. We can refer to all of these plans as being axial plans, meaning that there is a central axis and the design is essentially symmetrical on left and right of that center point. We looked at a New Kingdom painting from a tomb. This is the fowling scene, and we can see here that, again, there's a lot more naturalism in the animal figures than in the human figures, but we definitely have that hierarchy of scale there, that the less important figure is tiny. You can definitely see the detail in the naturalism, especially when you look at the birds. The way that these are painted is going to be pretty important for us, especially for those of you who will eventually take Art History Survey 2. There's a difference in the technique of painting on walls in ancient Egypt than we have in other cultures. This is what the Italians came to call secco fresco, meaning dry fresco, as opposed to their buon fresco or true fresco technique. The frescoes that we see in the Renaissance are painted on plaster that is still damp, and it allows the pigment to absorb into the plaster and become permanently part of the wall. That's more important in a climate such as Italy, where you have variations in humidity and in rainfall. In ancient Egypt, not an issue. So you could paint directly onto dry plaster and not worry about the wall cracking or splitting due to massive changes in humidity, since that just would not occur there. Perhaps the interesting artistic aspect of change in the Egyptian style happens for us during the New Kingdom in what we call the Amarna period. The Amarna Revolution is really a time during which the king chose to change his religious beliefs and then tried to impose that change on the rest of the culture. The Egyptians, of course, were a polytheistic culture, and under King Akhenaten, he decides to change his religion and began to follow a religion that believed in a single god, the god Aton, A-T-O-N. And as soon as we have a pharaoh who follows a single god, we start to see a little bit more naturalism in the way the pharaoh is depicted. Now, it's a little odd for us in our culture today. This figure reads a little more female because it certainly seems to have kind of an hourglass shape, but he's got slightly wider hips, fuller belly, a little bit more exaggeration in the lips and the natural aspects of the face. This is absolutely going to become the model for the artwork that depicts the royal family during Amarna period. So Akhenaten changes his name to honor the god Aten, and then begins this kind of shift in the changes in visual art. His queen is Nefertiti, and this is perhaps the most human-looking statue that we've seen up to this point. We know that the final surface is plaster, and that's been painted, and we know that this was made by an actual artist whose name we know. This was by Thutmose, and he kept this original piece as a model for many other depictions of the queen. So you can see that she looks more human, especially in the tendons and the connection between her neck into her shoulders and chest. She just seems more like a real person. The way that the lips are formed and the way that the cheeks respond to the movements of the muscles around the mouth and lips are really very believable, and that's very much a hallmark of this short period in Egyptian history. This is also from the Amarna period. This is Akhenaten and Nefertiti, and you see them on their thrones with their three daughters. So I would argue that the change here is not so much in proportion. They are wider in their hips. Their feet might be a little bigger. The heads, in terms of the elongation of the back of the skull, sure. Those are slight proportional changes. But the height issue, if you measured the height of the head from chin to the top of the head and measured that to the size of the torso and to the legs, the proportions are really similar to what we saw in earlier work. What becomes massively different, though, is the amount of movement and these curved lines and shapes. The swell in the belly, the curvature all around these figures is much different from what we've seen previously. The poses are more natural. The kids are trying to get mom's attention, trying to point out something to her. The child, the youngest daughter, seems to even be playing with mom's earring as if she's not fully aware of her status as a member of the royal family and needing to behave like a grown-up even though she's in a little body. It's kind of fascinating to think that there's more humanity in these images. This is the very end of that Amarna period, the tomb and the burial coffin for King Tut probably would not be remembered at all for our purposes, except for the fact that his tomb is one of the very few tombs that wasn't raided. In fact, when it was unearthed in the 20th century, it was completely intact. So because of King Tut's tomb not being grave robbed, we know the kind of splendor that the pharaohs would have been buried with. We also know that he had a very short reign, so not a lot of time to be able to do anything terribly important in terms of politics or war, but he also sort of inherited a lot of the objects from the previous dynasty. So he's buried with an enormous number of golden luxury items because, of course, the soul is coming back. That brings us then to the Last Judgment. This is from what have become known as a Book of the Dead, a scroll that tells the rituals of mummification and other kind of spell work for prolonging the life into the afterlife. The interesting thing to be aware of is that there are similar writings like this in tombs as far back as the pyramids. We saw them also to some degree in the rock-cut tombs. Now they become sort of separate texts that would still be interred with bodies. What you're seeing here involves a bit of storytelling. In fact, Hunefer is depicted 3 times. Hunefer is here, but also here and here. And in this case, he's kind of presenting his case before the gods. Here, Anubis takes him to have his soul judged. There's his heart being weighed against a feather. The feather itself is obviously heavier than his heart. It is lighter than the heart in the scales. And so that indicates to us that he's lived purely, that his heart is light, and he is able then to earn eternal afterlife. Now, if his heart had not passed the test, he would not be able to go on into this next phase. And here he's being presented to the god Osiris and his wife Isis, and in front of them are their children, who actually are also responsible for the canopic jars, the jars that your internal organs would be interred in your tomb as well. A remarkable story. This, again, is another Book of the Dead that tells a very similar type of story about the soul being judged and being presented to the god of the afterlife. The Temple of Horus is our example of a pylon entrance to a temple to a god and has sunken relief that comes to us from very late in Egyptian history. And of course, then Egypt becomes part of Rome.